The first function that we're going to go over is URL. So you can find out more about URL by going to this URL on api.drupal.org. What the URL function gives you is a way to take a path and any parameters that should be associated with that path, such as a fragment or a query string, and generate a path that will work on any page in Drupal from any page in Drupal. So you don't have to worry about linking from a page that appears to be inside of nested folders to another page that's at the root of a Drupal install. Chances are you've worked with HTML before, and you know that there are issues around using absolute URLs, which on the one hand guarantee that you'll get to the right path, but on the other hand are not flexible, because if you change the domain name of the site or move the site to a subfolder, then it won't work anymore. And because modules should be able to work across sites that have different domain names and that may be installed in subfolders on a site, then you want to make sure that we've got all of our bases covered, and URL helps you do that. So let's go ahead and look at some examples here. So we have a couple of variables here. Our output variable is collecting the HTML that will display on the page eventually, and our URL examples array is collecting examples of the URL function that we're then going to loop through and create HTML with to add to the output. Here's our first example. And you see here it's really simple, but there's a couple of key points that are important to grasp right away. So we're just passing it a single parameter, and that parameter is admin/modules. So you see there isn't a leading slash, so we're leaving that off, and there isn't a trailing slash either. This is the path to this page. So when we're talking about paths, we're extracting the domain name and any slashes or query strings or fragments that exist at the end of the path. Okay, let's take a look at another example. We're calling this one external path because we're pointing to a path outside of our current installation. So we're passing it the URL example.com, and we're giving it a full path. So URL will work in a case like this. So if you're pointing to a page that's internal, you want to use this type of syntax. And if you're pointing to an external page, you'll use the full absolute domain name, but then you can use the other tools that we're about to go over in the next examples. The next example is called absolute local path. And what we're doing is passing the URL function two parameters this time. The first one is the path, and the second one is an array of settings. So anytime we want to change the behavior of the URL that's output, we would add it to an array as a second parameter of URL. In this case, we're setting the absolute parameter to true. So absolute says we're going to create an absolute URL from this path. So it'll have the full domain name, so it will work even when the output of this page is on a different domain. So for example, this is perfect for RSS feeds that might display on some other site, but we don't want to use a relative path, which is the default for URL. So for example, this would display a relative path. So we want an absolute path in that case, so it points directly to our site. And so this is what we would pass it as one of the settings parameters. Our next example is called fragment, and this is an example of adding a fragment to the end of the URL. So that's when you see a hashtag with a string at the end of the URL, and so it points a user to a particular part of the page and will automatically scroll the browser down to that section. So we use the same structure that we used to pass absolute, but in this case we're passing an array, and there's one item in the array called fragment, and we're assigning it an ID of footer. So if we clicked this, it would take us to the footer of the page. Our final example of URL is called query string, and this is an example, as you may have guessed, of using a query string in a URL. The first parameter again is the path, and the second parameter is a list of settings. We have one setting here, and it's called query, and then we're passing it an array. So here we have an array inside of an array. It can look a little ugly, but it's actually pretty straightforward structure. In this array, we're passing the key value pairs that we want to pass through the query string. So if the query string should be the shape $destination equals admin, then we'd use this structure to assign the key a value of admin. And finally, what we're doing is running this URL examples array through a for each loop, pulling out the key, which is the name of the example, and the value, which is the output of the URL function. And we're adding it to the output variable, which will be displayed when somebody visits this URL, the tips URL. And we're creating a paragraph around that section, and we're adding a label for the title, just wrapping it in a strong tag, and then we're displaying the value. So let's go ahead and go to our tips page and take a look at our examples. So we have our simple path, which was just a basic path. The only thing that it changed about it was it added this slash in the front. Our second example was to an external path, example.com, and you see here it just rendered it as is because we didn't add any parameters to the end of it. Next, we had the absolute local path example, which passed it this path here, admin/modules, but also passed it the absolute parameter. So it made it a full URL complete with the domain name. Our next example was of a fragment. So we passed the path, and then we passed a settings array with just one parameter for fragment, and then we assigned it to footer. So all it did was add footer to the end with a hashtag. And then our final example was query string, where we added a query parameter, and the query parameter contained an array of key value pairs according to the variables that we wanted to pass through the query string. If you want to learn everything that you can do with the URL function, go ahead and go to the api.drupal.org page about URL. And again, that's here in the source code above the examples. Okay, let's move on to the L function. L is very similar to URL. It uses a lot of the same syntax and parameters, but it adds the additional functionality of creating a link from the URL. So we can pass it a path, but we can also pass it the text that should display in the link that's generated from that path. This source code here is very similar to the way we were structuring the URL examples. We're just adding a title, we're creating an array of examples of the L function, and finally we're looping through the L examples and creating some HTML output for that. So here's our first example, just simple path. What we're doing is copying the examples that we used in URL examples, but we're running it through L instead. So simple path again is just we're passing it a path with no extra parameters. The only difference between L and URL in this case is that we're passing it the link text and then the path. And if we look at external path, the example here, it's the same structure, the title of the link and then the URL of the link. Absolute local path is our first example that uses a parameter in the settings array. So we have the link text, the path, and then an array we're passing it that is the absolute setting, which makes this link absolute to our Drupal installation. Next we have fragment. Again, it's the same thing. We're just passing it a link title in the beginning. And our final example is of using a query string. And again, we're passing it the settings parameter, but we're only passing one setting in here for the query string. And because this is a little bit longer, I've separated the array out into multiple lines. We have a destination variable, which tells Drupal what page to go to when the form on a certain page gets submitted. And then random string. And this random string will come into play in a later section of this video. I've added one more example here that's unique to the L function. Because the L function outputs some HTML, we can set attributes on that HTML, whereas URL just generates the path. So we do that by passing the attributes parameter to the settings parameter in the L function. Now you see I'm using a similar structure here to what we used with the query string, a set of key value pairs where the key corresponds to the name of the attribute and the value corresponds to the value of the attribute. So we've got the class, we're setting target to blank so it'll open up in a new page when this link is clicked, and just a rel to demonstrate that we can pass other parameters as well. So this is not a limited set. Any attribute you add this way will be added as an attribute, even if it's not valid. And finally, if we're looking at the source code here, we're looping through the L-examples array and creating some HTML output. Okay, let's go look at the output now. I'm going to scroll down to our examples of L section here. We have our simple path, and as I'm hovering over these, you'll see the URL in the lower left-hand corner of Firefox here. So I'll reference those as we go through. All of these examples point to the same URLs as the URL functions above, so you can just hover over these and just verify that the URLs are the same. Here's our fragment with a fragment. Our query string has one more additional query string with some broken HTML in it. And then our final one is attributes. Now I'm going to go ahead and turn on Firebug on Firefox so we can take a quick look at this and see to make sure that the attributes are being passed properly. So we have our class of active, which we passed. We have our rel of some value, which we passed, and our target of blank. So this is working just right. Awesome.